You know this virtual world more than anything because as someone who's essentially in charge of fundraising for EMEA, your job has looked wildly different without being able to interact with people face to face. How much more difficult has it been to raise funds this year without that?
Well, thank you, first of all, Dani, for having me. It's definitely been a different year this year. I haven't been on a plane for business purposes since February of last year, and I think many of my peers are in the same position. But overall, the industry has, your colleague just mentioned the stats, been able to continue to raise capital from investors. It's a very stable asset class. Our investors have seen great returns over the last 10 plus years, and so continue to support the asset class. And with that, fundraising has just changed more generally. I think the GPs in the market have been able to do business over Zoom largely, due diligence meetings over Zoom. And I think the long history of face-to-face meetings and the goodwill we've all built up, I think has supported that. So it's not for the first time that investors are meeting with GPs. It's oftentimes re-ups that are being done. And so relationships are very strong. And when that's the foundation, you can take that more easily onto Zoom.
What happens if you don't already have that relationship, though? What does it mean if, you're not an Advent, you're a new fund that's trying to raise capital? Was that just not possible really this year?
I think in selected spaces it has been possible. It really depends on the fund and the person and the people raising it. I think oftentimes if you have the case of a spin out where maybe a team leaves a well-known GP, but the individuals are well known to the LP community, I think then it's definitely possible to raise. It also depends a bit on the sector that new fund potentially is targeting. But for true sort of startups and new funds where maybe the team is less established and hasn't worked together before, what I'm at least hearing from the industry peers and colleagues is that that's been tougher this time. Also because the larger managers have returned to market more quickly maybe than historically. I think the average has gone down from maybe every 3-4 years to every 2 years coming back to market. And so the re-up pipeline has been pretty strong and has kept LPs busy.
A lot of fundraising, definitely, we've seen, but a lot of change happened, not just the COVID pandemic, of course. There's a lot of social change happening now, too. Has that changed your interactions, or at least what investors are asking of Advent going forward?
Yeah, I think what you're touching on there is really the topic of ESG, and environmental, social governance. These big topics are really important to our investors. They have been important for the last years, but in particular this year with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, that's really been elevated on the agenda. And so LPs ask the right questions. They should ask the questions of their GPs in terms of what the GPs are doing in their own house, but also with the portfolio companies they own. And I think we see ourselves as stewards of our companies. We can, with a strong governance framework that the private equity industry has, we can really affect change. And so from that perspective, we're really doing the best in pushing certain agenda items forward in our own company and in our portfolio.
You mentioned they're asking about what's going on in-house. What do those conversations look like? What are they asking about there?
It's oftentimes, and maybe not surprisingly, in particular through COVID, it's a lot of questions around culture and how we as Advent have been able to continue to do business. It's questions around, in particular, diversity, equity, inclusion. What are we doing to drive and to establish a more diverse workforce? I think at Advent, we've done a lot around that topic. We take the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion really, it's very important for us. We think about it around development, recruitment, retention, and back to culture. And, LPs have asked a lot of those questions last year, how we continue to work well remotely and, continue to thrive even in this difficult environment.
That's interesting. Does that then mean that a lot of the change that happens in the private capital industry in terms of diversity, is it investor-led? Is it LP-led?
Look, it's LP-led, it's GP-led. I think it's, plain and simple, the right thing to do to ensure that that our workforce represents, the current world out there. And so, but it is investor-led as well. And investors ultimately speak with their capital. And so they are very much in the position to demand change and to at least open a discussion about change. And I think that's what LPs should do. They should just ask the question, what are you doing internally to promote more diversity along gender, ethnicity, and all these topics? And I think when the LP asks those questions, the GP at least starts thinking about them if they haven't before, and that will change the industry. It's been the same with ESG topics over the last 10 years, and I think that focus this year has shifted more onto the DEI topics.